Well, Rob, we just had a very interesting conversation with friends. And, as you're on a journey, sometimes things come across your path. Well, this book came across my path in two ways. I saw it in our church atrium, and I was looking at it and wanted to pick it. And then little did I know, my wife was leading me away from it because she had put it under the Christmas tree for me. I think God intended me to read this book, and that book is The Great Dechurching. We're currently in the middle of the largest and fastest religious shift in history of the country. So 15% of Americans, 40 million people, are deciding to dechurch. I think we're gonna go on our virtual road trip down to Orlando. What do you think, Rob?
Yep, I think that's the plan. We're going to be talking with Michael Graham. He is the program director for the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. He received his MDiv at Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando, and I actually think he's actually speaking to us from there today. He is also the executive producer of As in Heaven, which is his podcast.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and your co-authors on this.
Co-wrote the book with Jim Davis, who happens to be my pastor, and he's the teaching pastor at Orlando Grace Church. And then Ryan Burge is a social scientist who's also a professor at Eastern Illinois University, and who also happens to be a pastor of a rural Baptist church as well. Ryan's brilliant and is probably best known for being the best guy in America on religious data. So we work with Ryan and another political scientist, Paul Jupe, to conduct the 3 phases of research.
Why did you decide to zoom in on these people and do research, and what was the heart behind it? Writing a book is not an easy task, takes effort. So why did you and your co-authors decide to go this direction?
So we went down this path because, Jim and I were pastors both at the same time at Orlando Grace. I was the executive pastor, he was the teaching pastor. And we were, having conversations with our elders. We'd run across some information that kind of said that maybe half of our city, almost half of our city was dechurched. And so we wanted to know more about that. So I went on a journey to basically, digest any and all either research, writing, or quantitative data that was, kind of going on with respect to dechurching. And there just wasn't enough that was either recent or granular enough in order to be actionable from a philosophy of ministry standpoint as a local church or even as an individual. And so then that led us on a path of knowing that we needed to go and commission that research. We fundraised for it. And then we got with Ryan and with Paul to get the kind of the best experts in the country on this. We wanted to do that in a way that was clergy and academia together.
Who'd you write this book for? And maybe it's multiple audiences, but and what do you hope that they get out of it?
So we wrote the book primarily for people who are going to church and are sad about the people who used to go to church with them who aren't anymore, and they miss them. And so that they have an understanding of, well, who all has left and why did they leave? And is there any hope? Can I do anything about this? Either as an individual or as a local church. The secondary audience for the book is people who are clergy or working in a kind of church or ministry nonprofit environment to kind of demystify what's going on with all of these things and give rails to run on from an institutional standpoint. And then there's a tertiary audience that's there in terms of people who are just interested in sociological or cultural shifts of a large scale that are large enough to change elections or make major shifts in American public life.
Welcome to A World Intention podcast, a place where we examine the opposing pulls and struggles of life to uncover clarity, purpose, and practical solutions. Come join us as we seek to get comfortable facing the uncomfortable. This is A World Intention.
Can you just walk the listener through a little bit about what's different between dechurched and unchurched, and what do you mean by mainline versus evangelical? Because we're going to zoom in on the evangelicals, and I want people to understand kind of what the scope of the 40 million is.
Yeah, that's great. I love defining terms, and having clarity on technical terms is super helpful for all conversations, especially ones like this. Somebody who's dechurched is somebody who used to go to church at least once a month or more. and now goes to church less than once per year. So like if you go to church for Christmas and Easter, we didn't count you in that 40 million. So there's probably actually more people who are dechurched than even the 40 million, but we wanted to have a conservative, kind of definition for that. And so unchurched is somebody who has never regularly gone to church. Okay. So unchurched, they've never been in the habit of going to church. Dechurched is they had that regular monthly habit and now they don't. So in the book, we talk about 6 different profiles of people who have left houses of worship, particularly Christian houses of worship in America. So there's the mainline group, and those are traditions. This is, some people call that liberal Protestantism. Sometimes, mainline Protestants. This would be, denominations like the Episcopal Church, Disciples of Christ, Church of Christ, Lutherans, Methodists, so on and so forth. And then the evangelicals are basically Protestants who aren't mainline. And so it would be like the Southern Baptist Convention, Presbyterians, these kinds of things. And so we had the mainline and Roman Catholic profiles, but then the third phase of our study focused in on evangelicals. And from that, we developed 4 different profiles. You can read the book, The Great Dechurching, to kind of get granularity on those things. But those were basically cultural Christians, mainstream evangelicals, ex-evangelicals, and then those who were BIPOC. That stands for Black, Indigenous, Persons of Color. And so those are the 6 profiles, and each one of those 6 profiles is very, very different in terms of their demographics. They're different about when they left. They're different. They had different reasons for why they left, and they all had very different views on ethics, very different views on doctrine, and very different rates of willingness to return or not return to the type of church that they left.
Essentially, unchurched are just one generation removed from dechurched.
That's right. So it's kind of like COVID, right? You got you got a spike, right? The beta spike of COVID, is dechurching, and the Omicron spike that's coming is, the unchurched, because, a generation of dechurched people are going to raise a generation of unchurched kids. So the problems are going to shift from dechurching issues to unchurched, because eventually the dechurching spike has to end. Why does it have to end? Well, it ends the same reason that, a COVID spike ends, because so many people dechurch that there aren't enough people who still go to church on a monthly basis to keep that spike going. So we have a window, here of opportunity while people are still within, 3 to 30 years of, being regularly in the habit to do something about that. Otherwise, in a generation, we're going to have a whole host of different problems and different challenges among the unchurched.
What do you think are the major implications? Like we were talking about that, the dechurched become unchurched, but like, what does that do? Some people may say, you know what? Who cares, right? Some, maybe, especially those outside the church, maybe that they think it's a good thing. Maybe religion is a bad thing. So what do you think? I think this impacts some of the things you said outside of people even who go. It affects the broader society. So tell me what you guys found as far as the key implications of this dechurching.
Yeah, so in terms of key implications, let's say you're totally secular, let's say you hate religion, you're atheist, you're agnostic, you're a nun, nothing in particular, and you're looking at this and you're like, cool, awesome, more people like me. Well, you might care because of a couple different reasons. First is religious nonprofits make up potentially as much as 40% of the social safety net in America. When you're talking about 1 in 6 adult Americans changing their habits and rhythms, that's $1.3 trillion in GDP that just left houses of worship. If they were charitable at the same rate as, kind of the national average of people who were church, that's $25 billion that just left, kind of the social safety net, in the country. So that's one piece. Another piece is, I think, increased tension at the for the fabric of American culture and society. institutions play a key role in holding society together. I mean, the value of an institution is you're voluntarily putting yourself around other people where maybe there's enough there to, whatever the area of interest, to seek commonality, but you're also forcing yourself into, being around other people who have different perspectives on all sorts of different things. And I think that that's a good thing. We have an elder at our church who is fond of saying, the ability to handle dissonance is a sign of emotional, relational, and spiritual maturity. I'm going to say that again. The ability to handle dissonance is a sign of emotional, relational, and spiritual maturity. I totally agree with him on that. And I think institutions ideally are playing a role at helping people develop their dissonance muscles. And so I think that, the dechurching phenomenon, even if you're, totally secular and hate religion, I think that you're talking about this is atrophying, kind of people's ability to have robust dissonance muscles.
So in other words, the church gives a place for people to practice getting along with people that don't necessarily agree wholeheartedly with one another.
Well, I mean, just look at all the 59 one another's in the New Testament.
Right.
How many of those one another's in the New Testament, deal with some kind of combination of forbearance or patience or seeking understanding? And so, yeah, I mean, and why are those there in the text? They're there in the text because, Paul and other New Testament authors know part of being in community means living in tension with other people. When people can curate their entire digital world and literally mute or unfollow or, whatever other people, then it only makes sense that over time, if you don't have digital resilience of having dissonant voices in your life, well, isn't that going to just unconsciously or subconsciously begin to spill over into how your embodied life then is? And so I think tech has conditioned us to be less resilient on dissonance, and that's having a spillover effect in the people who we're willing to have embodied relationships with.
Yeah, no, that's actually, I mean, that concept, I think, totally aligns with what Rob and I are doing on this podcast. I mean,
Comfortable.
Getting comfortable in the
In the uncomfortable.
And honestly, what's interesting about going into season 3, season 1 and season 2 was largely about, I think it starts with us reflecting on our own tensions, challenging them, and why would I be polarized one way or another? And the answer, I think, is surrendering to Christ, because that's what gives you the strength to not be polarized in your own heart, in your between heart and mind. But what we're realizing in season 3, as we're talking about the local body, it's kind of what you said, between the poles of people as agents of redemption, people who have surrendered, have worked out that muscle. They can now fill the gaps to help people close the gaps and say, hey, let me point you to a reason why we can have these conversations. So I've never thought about it like almost like the church is like a gym to work out these conversations between people. But I think that's a good picture that really resonates.
Can we talk science for a minute?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to get nerdy and talk science for a minute. Okay. So, 2020, 2021, if you're listening to this and you're clergy or you're in ministry, you'll know this and feel this acutely. It was challenging, really, really challenging. And here's why. I think just about everybody in the world was emotionally compromised in some way, shape, or form. And so what happens in the brain when somebody is put into a high stimuli, fight, flight, or freeze situation, in the brain, there's a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And if you know this, bear with me. The prefrontal cortex is where reason and rationality and persuasion occurs. And so, but when somebody is psychosomatically in a state of fight, flight, or freeze, because there's something that they're interacting with that they are viewing as a threat to their person, then those faculties get cut off and a different part of the brain gets engaged, basically the amygdala. And sometimes what's released is cortisol in the brain. And this is, kind of to engage, various parts of the body that allow you to deal with high threat situations. Here's the point. Here's why this is a challenge. And here's the connection to living intention. Jim and I realized that in order to pastor the people in our church, we actually, they weren't ready on a Sunday morning to necessarily hear a sermon. They needed to actually be pre-pastored first. And so we developed this idea of pre-pastoring. In other words, we had to get people in a place where they get out of fight, flight, or freeze and where they can be calm. See, in order for, so that their faculties of reason can go from being not intact to intact. And so in order to do that, we have to lead in a way that is a calm, non-anxious presence. If we want to help other people, we have to embody, being emotionally well regulated. We have to lead in a way that's calm and non-anxious so that people can interact with the things that we're actually saying, and so that communication can actually be transacted. Just because two people are talking in a room doesn't mean that communication is occurring. A lot of times communication is not occurring because different people are not necessarily hearing each other, particularly, if they're emotionally dysregulated.
Yeah, you know what's interesting about that? I think there's probably people even listening to that who that stresses their brain because they're like, just preach the word. We don't need any of this like psychosomatic conversation, right? Or like medical research. And I think you're right on the money that like how you present as well matters. I mean, does this one concept I really liked in your book was you talked about a forecourt. Does this connect to that? And if so, talk about. I love that idea. So, like, can you talk about the forecourt?
Yeah. So the idea of a forecourt is, if you think back to ancient Israel and even the temple itself, you have this concept of Solomon's porch. And even though you had Gentiles who weren't able to go all the way into kind of the main place of worship, certainly not into the Holy of Holies, but there was also this place where people could be and engage ideas. Maybe a different way to put it in, that's less culturally distant to us, is maybe the idea of a front porch. And so with a front porch, this is a place, architecturally, that's outside your home and is available to other people in your neighborhood, in your community. And all sorts of things can happen, on a front porch. You can have a delicious beverage, you can have a good conversation, you can rock in a chair or in a swing. And it's a place that is a third place that exists between two worlds. It exists between a community and between your home, where all sorts of deeper conversation and growth in relationship can occur.
So when we did the street interviews, we talked to a bunch of different people hurting, Michael. And what I realized was the church people were just saying, hey, we're going to minister to the homeless, right? But there was all these people that looked a little bit more like me that had all these pains. I'm like, how are we ministering to these people? And I think you've classified some groupings that maybe we can think strategically about as a church, different kind of like entryways into these four. So can we start talking about them?
Yeah. So at a high altitude, of the six profiles, mainline and Roman Catholic are like 15 to 20 million people, and then people who left evangelical churches are about 15 million people. So of the people who left evangelical churches, yes, we have four profiles. So those are those who are cultural Christians, mainstream, ex-evangelical, and BIPOC. And so that's 15 million people with those groups. And the cultural Christians were about half of that. And these are people, obviously they, had the regular habit of going to church, but they did not seem to have very deep doctrinal understandings of the faith. Only 1% of this group said that Jesus is the Son of God. And they're middle age, about early 40s. They left about a decade ago, and these folks are doing pretty well for themselves monetarily, and it just kind of and education wise, and it just kind of looks like the American dream moving. Inconvenience kind of got them largely out of the habit of going to church.
Would you say that that group in particular is where the forecourt is most relevant, just to give them a space?
I think so. These folks need to be at your dinner table. They have some questions. There might be a little bit of friction, here and there. I don't think they actually understand the Bible. I don't think they understand the gospel. And so there definitely needs to be a place where you can have conversation about those things that probably isn't in a church setting. And they don't need to come in the front door. The cultural Christians really need the side door of your dinner table, your front porch, some other setting where they can have they can grow and have conversation, have their questions answered, develop trust, those kinds of things.
So the home, it plays a key role in that group.
Yes, hospitality is critical.
I mean, but this is important as we're thinking about the local church body, right? The pastors don't set that up, right? I mean, you're talking about 50% of the evangelicals need to be reached by individuals in the church saying, "Hey, come to my house and have a comfortable place," right? Because that they'll be more attracted or maybe comfortable to that to then open up the doorway. So, I mean, this is one of the things we're debating about or wrestling through is how much does the church have to do versus the individual, right? I mean, we are all essentially the local body. We make it up, right? But there are some things that can be done kind of more programmatically or ones that are just done
More organic. Yeah.
So I think you're saying for the cultural Christians, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems like more of an organic move by the individuals in the body is probably more effective than what the pastor can organize.
Yes, it's definitely, for this particular profile, far more energy needed on the organic than the institutional. That won't necessarily be the case for some of the other profiles, but it certainly is for this one.
Okay, let's talk about another profile. Which one do you want to do next, Mike?
Yeah, so the mainstream evangelicals who dechurched, these people left around the time of COVID. They have a very high view of the Bible. They definitely understand the gospel. 98% say Jesus is the Son of God. They have a greater understanding of the gospel than people who actually go to church by just a little bit. They believe that they'll be back in the church. Cultural Christians, around half of them are willing to return to an evangelical church, but 100% of this mainstream evangelical group are willing to return to an evangelical church today. These folks just need a nudge. They don't even need your dinner table. They don't need, lots of conversations, on the front porch. It's like, hey man, you want to come to church with me this Sunday? I really like my church. I think you'll like it too. A water cooler moment, a text, a phone call, those kinds of things. These folks just need a nudge. And so they're basically the same age, a little less income than the first group, but they're just regular folks. They just got out of the habit. Maybe it was COVID, kids, life. They moved, some of those kinds of things. But there's no real. They don't have big questions. There's not pain. They just got out of the habit, and they just need somebody to encourage them to come back with them. And hey, you want to grab lunch after? Let's go to church together and grab lunch after. That's all these folks need.
One of the things that we talk about, Neil and I, is the difference between being explicit about the gospel and implicit about the gospel. And I sometimes wonder if some of these groups would be more effectively reached with more implicit gospel programs within the church. Do you think there's a space for that in the church, where we're not, inviting people in and doing the Jesus juke and then, getting, the hammer out and presenting the gospel, or I mean, is there room for just, fun times within the church to sort of imply the gospel?
So I think when we have a community that is intellectually, emotionally, and in terms of the way that and missionally engaged, well, I think that that's a community that's going to be thicker and more attractive at the intuitive levels. And so it's not like people necessarily walk around and, are thinking super cognitively about those things. What do we remember about our interactions with people? We often remember how somebody or something made us feel. And so when we seek to have a good balance of truth, goodness, and beauty, either individually, as the gospel kind of works its way out through our whole person and our whole story, or institutionally in our local churches, well, I think that those things are just intuitively more attractive for people. So in some ways, these things just really just boil down to, are we going to relate to people on an individual and an institutional level with relational wisdom? And are we able to do those things because the gospel has deeply changed us?
I mean, so the strong encouragement I'm hearing from you is for these two groups, the cultural Christian and the dechurched mainstream evangelical, like it's just literally getting out of our comfort zone a little bit to say, hey, and depending on kind of their belief system, if it's more in line with yours, it's more just a nudge to come to church. If it's a little bit maybe different and you need to kind of wrestle through issues, have them over the dinner table. But I mean, a lot of that, I'm struck by a lot of that is happening outside of the church, right? So
Yeah.
what about ex-evangelicals? I think that's maybe a little bit different story, right?
And it seemed to touch you more in an emotional way from the book, reading the book.
Yeah, for sure. So it's not a normal thing to open a large spreadsheet and to start crying.
Yeah.
But that's what happened for me when I was looking at this particular profile. We asked about how, all of the, the people that we studied, we asked them about how they were doing on anxiety, depression, loneliness, and suicidal thoughts. And when I got to this particular cell that dealt with suicidal thoughts among ex-evangelicals, we asked the question, on a scale of 0 to 100, how would you rate yourself in how you were doing with respect to suicidal thoughts? Now, 100 on this scale is I have absolutely, no challenges with respect to suicidal thoughts. And 0 is I'm battling suicidal thoughts on a daily basis. And this group, on average, rated themselves 16 out of 100, meaning the overwhelming majority of the people in this group are battling suicidal thoughts on a regular, if not day-to-day basis. And this was just brutal for me. I mean, how can you not be impacted, by that when you think about, okay, I mean, literally, I can't tell you how many times I've wondered, like, have some of the people, who filled out this survey, like, are they still with us? Like, did thoughts become, an ideation become something else, that just brings tremendous sadness to me. And it also brings urgency, to, and personhood to, this isn't just like numbers on a spreadsheet. These are humans. These are real people. And these are people that it's like, I think stories like Robin Williams and others should, somebody can look very happy and funny or these different kinds of things on the outside, but you have no idea, they could be wrestling with really difficult or really dark things, in their person. So you don't know, every interaction is an opportunity that we have to be, light and salt to other people and agents of hope.
Well, what is your church doing for that group of people? I mean, does that point to the need for having some counselors on staff, or I mean, what are some practical things the church should be thinking about in regards to that group?
Yeah, and let me just make one clarifying point because I like Rob's question, but this is the group that like has a 0% chance of wanting to come back to church, right? Is this that group?
We called this group the ex-evangelicals because 0% of them were willing to return to an evangelical church. Now, about 80% of them were willing to go to a different kind of Christian expression of the faith. Only 21% of this group, were totally done with, church of any kind altogether. And actually, there's a lot of gospel very much still intact among this group, even though none of them are willing to return to an evangelical church. And so you can see the pain of the tension that they had. They were not fitting in the churches that they were in. There was political tension. There was this group is very allergic to racism. They're very allergic to misogyny. They're allergic to political polarization, political syncretism. They're
We met
allergic
some of
to,
these people on the street.
Yeah, we met some of them.
Yeah.
They're allergic to clergy scandal. They're allergic to clergy abuse. All of these things, those are all very much animating issues for that group. And so, what ex-evangelicals need from us is they need for us to be, to react to their stories without defensiveness. And they need to be able, to have us just hear those things and absorb them. And they need to be told, as much as possible that, well, hey, you're not crazy, man. If that were your story, like, I would feel very, very similar to you. That isn't my story, and I don't pretend to understand what that feels like for you. But man, I am so sorry. If there's something that's occurred that is not the way that it should be, validate that. And you can be sitting across the table from somebody who you disagree with vehemently on ideas. Okay, fine. I'm not asking you to, change your ideas because there's somebody sitting across the table from you who have different ideas for the sake of the gospel. That's not what Paul meant to, by becoming all things to all people. But what you can often do to other people is you can validate their experience of the world. In other words, even when you have significant disagreements ideologically, you can often validate people's emotions. And man, I'm so sorry that was your experience. I can only imagine what that was, what that's like for you. I don't think that that's the way, that things should be.
That's exactly what we found out on the street. Rob and I didn't have an agenda. We asked them a few questions about kind of their experience with the church, if they went or not to the church. And we didn't pass any judgment. We just listened. We gave them open-ended questions too. And it was so shocking to me, and I think to them, that they were like, wait, you didn't, like Rob just said, Jesus juke me? You didn't give me a Romans road, and you just wanted to hear me? And then it was so crazy. Then they were like, well, what do you guys believe? So like we got these atheists asking us what we believe just because we asked them a few questions with a mic.
Well, we had people sharing really deep pains about church abuse, about like just friend abuse. I mean, it was really interesting how much people were willing to open up just by listening.
So to Rob's question, I mean, he mentioned counseling. But you're saying, I think, also just maybe it's a combination, listening, like looking, seeing people, hearing them, listening to them, but maybe there is some space for counseling to come into the church, or what do you think about that?
Well, I definitely think mental health is a real opportunity in general for the dechurched. So just on average, the people who left houses of worship were doing worse on anxiety, depression, loneliness, and suicidal thoughts across the board versus people who were, going to church on a monthly basis. And so I think that there's definitely, if you're listening to this and you're in, one of the mental health professions, like you have a really important job. And look, stories want to be told. When those stories are shut up in us, it can be cancerous, to our person. And so if we, part of, emotional maturity is being able to hold other people's tension and dissonance and sit in those things, with them. And so I think when we can develop resilience in our ability to do that, you can't underestimate what occurs when you do that for somebody else and are willing to sit in their pain and sit in their tension with them.
Let's talk about the last group, which is the BIPOC group. What's interesting here, I think, to note, you didn't set up 4 different groups and just kind of set them and then like massage the data into it. The data told you how these groups came out. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so one of the nice things about working with Ryan Burge, is he's, an expert in data analytics on religion data. And so he used a machine learning algorithm to develop people who had very common answer choices on things like their beliefs, when did they leave, why did they leave, their willingness to return. One of the things that we didn't allow the algorithm to see, though, was race or ethnicity as it was developing those profiles. It was sorting on about 20 different variables, and that was not one of the variables that it was sorting on. And so race and ethnicity is a significant category in how people see and experience American public life. And
so who are these BIPOC people we're talking about?
the first profile was almost monolithically white. In the high 90s, the mainstream evangelicals, they were 91% white, and then the ex-evangelicals were 82% white. So the BIPOC group is 100% not white. So overwhelmingly, this group is African American, 76%, and male, 68%. So when you combine those things, you're talking about 2.5 million people in the group altogether, about 1.25 million Black men. Now, what's even more interesting about this group is compared to people who are either churched or dechurched, they had the highest income and the highest education of anybody that we looked at. I mean, we're talking significant six-figure incomes, and people who are doing very well for themselves in American public life. And so you have 1.25 affluent, highly educated Black men who left evangelical churches largely in the late 1990s.
Wow.
What is going on?
Yeah,
what is going on?
That is interesting.
That is interesting. Wow.
So
what is going on, Michael?
Yeah.
So when I think about the people who are in this profile, I don't think that it's necessarily ultra representative of BIPOC people this is not like necessarily an average slice of BIPOC people in America, but what you have here is kind of a selection bias. You have people who are economically upwardly mobile. They're probably living in affluent communities, and they're probably largely going to church in places that are geographically proximate. Well, if you're in an affluent suburb, because of the history that's there, in many ways problematic history, white flight from the cities, in the post-civil rights movement era, well, you're probably worshiping in a predominantly white evangelical context. At some point, the dissonance that was there, it could be on a number of levels. Certainly, it's there relationally, culturally, and potentially even ethnically. What's interesting is that the overwhelming majority in the mid 60s, in terms of percentage-wise, of these folks, even though they dechurched before all the other evangelical profiles, imagine being out of the habit of going to church on a monthly basis for like 25 to 28 years. And yet 2/3 of the people in this group are willing to return to an evangelical church today. So, there's definitely dissonance that was there and some pain there for this group, but it doesn't seem to be ultimately fatal for most in the long run of things. So one category I want to introduce that we talk about in the book is people who are casually dechurched versus those who are dechurched casualties. The cultural Christians in the mainstream, they are almost monolithically casually dechurched. In other words, the people who are casually dechurched, which is about 75% of, so 30 of the 40 million people are more casually dechurched, they didn't necessarily leave houses of worship with intentionality. They didn't necessarily leave with pain or hurt or these different kinds of things. It's just the inertia of life had them moving on. Things like I moved, attendance was inconvenient, some kind of family change like marriage, divorce, remarriage, or the birth of a child. For the dechurched casualties, they left with a high degree of intentionality, typically with some form of pain, either interpersonally or institutionally or both. And so the ex-evangelicals fit that dechurched casualty, and then the BIPOC group is a little bit of casual
of both.
and casualty.
Well, briefly then address maybe some things that you see the church being able to do to reach out to this group, because the BIPOCs, I'm not sure we've addressed that quite yet. Like what opens the door of the church for them?
There's definitely more social concern that's there among the BIPOC group. It's only probably mirrored also by the mainstream group. Both of those groups are looking for a church that will care about doctrine and ethics at the same time. And so, the BIPOC group definitely felt like evangelical churches were not doing enough good in the communities where they were at. So there's a level of social consciousness that's there that's definitely an animating concern for them. And I think, when you drill down for that group, they're just looking for good relationships, and they're looking for people, they're looking for a church institutionally that will emphasize the truth, goodness, and beauty of the gospel all at the same time.
I mean, there's so much in this book that you can just kind of linger on and think about. But one thing you just said that I think it's important to kind of the broader church conversation, and I've seen this true, is that you talk about a confessional versus a missional church, and how that concept, that you really kind of need both of those to demonstrate true biblical love. So could you walk through what you mean by confessional versus missional? And really my question is, beyond the definitions, is why do churches seem to get stuck in one or the other? Why don't they do both?
Yeah, churches get stuck in one or the other for the same reason people get stuck in one political party or the other. You know, we like our binaries
Yeah,
because
we really do.
when life brings you challenging things, well, you want to find comfort in lots of other people who share common responses to those challenging things. Confessionalism is the idea that we want to be connected historically to the creeds and confessions that we've been given. And we have everything from the Apostles' Creed and Nicene Creed, and in the very first years of our Christian faith, all the way to the various different creeds and confessions that came out of the Protestant Reformation. It's good for churches to have a sense of historical grounding and to be able to believe and confess the very same things that other people have believed and confessed for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Those are good things. And it's good to be clear on what we believe on important doctrines, particularly things that are absolutely essential to being Christians. Things like the Trinity, the fundamental reliability of the Bible, Jesus's sinless life, his substitutionary death, the bodily resurrection and ascension of Christ. These are essentials, and it's good for people to be really clear on those things. Obviously, those doctrines should move our whole person and not just our brains, but that doesn't always occur. And then the missional impulse is, well, what are we doing as the people of God in our communities? And so what does that look like in terms of our outward movement? How are we helping to communicate our timeless message in a way that people in our communities can see and understand? And so that's the kind of missional impulse. And what often happens is that a church will become kind of slotted or rutted in one of those two, kind of broad categories, and oftentimes at the expense of the other. But what's good is we need to take the very best of both of those worlds and kind of leave the things that are maybe weaknesses about only being in one of those traditions over the other. So the weakness of confessionalism only can be maybe a more stale orthodoxy, or not a vibrant experience of the gospel. Or you could be in isolation, kind of sequestered from the rest of culture and society, and not having many people in your life who aren't already Christians. And then the weakness of a missional only impulse could be, well, you could then end up in a place where, well, the exercising of your faith just becomes social only in nature, and you don't end up bringing the supernatural into your desire to build a better community, to build a better city. And people need to know the reason for the hope that we have, and they need to know about Jesus's life, death, and resurrection and his work, and how those things need to be applied to their lives.
Well, Michael, this has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate you taking time to chat with us, and how it really connects to kind of what we're doing here, talking about tension. Any closing comments you want to make that we haven't addressed yet?
I just think that there's just tremendous hope in all of this. Going into this whole thing, I didn't have a whole lot of hope, because the two stories that were being told were this: if your media diet leaned a little bit left, well, all these people have left for racism, misogyny, political syncretism, clergy scandal, clergy abuse. And if if your media diet leaned a little bit right, well, people left because of secular progressivism, the sexual revolution, these kinds of things. Well, what am I going to do about all that stuff? I can't change any of those things. I have no agency. I can't, those are cultural forces well beyond, any kind of, power or purview that I have. But the good news in all of this was that most people left for very pragmatic reasons, and most people are willing to return. Well, gosh, that's something I can do something about. And I can love the people that God is consistently putting right in front of me. So if you're listening to this, I want this to be very simple and very concrete for you. Take a step of relational risk. I just think that for most people, this is not going to be a relationship ending conversation. And if it is, well, trust that to the Lord. But by and large, when I'm looking at this data, these are not relationship ending conversations. Take relational risk. Take the next step relationally with somebody who God just seems to consistently be putting more and more in front of you. And I want to encourage you that I think that you are going to be glad that you took a step of relational risk with somebody else.
I think that's a great closing. I mean, it's really practical. It boils it down into something we can all do very simply. And whether you invite them to dinner or just press the conversation to maybe a deeper place, or invite them to your church, there's several ways they can do that. But I think it's really practical and helpful. So thank you for that.
Yeah, Michael, thank you so much for taking some time out of your morning to talk with us. We've really enjoyed it.
Thank you, guys. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you all for listening to another episode of A World in Tension.